Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight we're going to spend a few quiet hours in the company of some of the most celebrated, most admired, and most spectacularly unreasonable men who ever lived. Men in polished steel. Men on enormous horses. Men who genuinely believed that being called a coward at dinner was a more serious problem than being stabbed. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Pull the blanket a little higher. And if you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the past, feel free to like the video, but only if you truly want to. And do let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. It is always strangely comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the world, in different time zones, in different weather, drifting off to the same old stories. Now settle in. Let the room go soft around the edges. Because to understand why medieval knights behaved the way they did, we cannot start with a battlefield. We have to start somewhere much smaller and much quieter. We have to start in a nursery. That is the part most people skip. When we imagine knights, we imagine the finished product. The armour, the lance, the banner snapping in the wind. We imagine a man already fully formed, already fearless, already thundering towards something he probably should have thought about a little longer. But nobody is born wanting to charge into a wall of spears. That has to be taught. And medieval Europe taught it very, very thoroughly. If you were born into a noble family somewhere in England, France, or the German lands during the High Middle Ages, your future was arranged for you long before you had any opinions about it. A peasant boy might one day inherit a strip of land and the exhausting business of coaxing food out of it. A merchant's son might inherit a trade, a ledger, and a reputation for honest weights. A noble boy inherited an expectation. He was going to fight. Not perhaps, not if it suited him. He was going to fight, and everyone around him had already agreed on this before he could form a full sentence. Medieval society was not especially interested in hearing that a young lord's true calling was music, or gardening, or sitting quietly by a window watching the rain. There was no career counsellor. There was only a family name, a set of lands, and a very clear understanding of what men of that family did. At around 7 years old, many noble boys left home. This is one of those details that sounds almost impossible to modern ears. 7. Barely out of infancy. Still losing teeth, and off he went, sometimes many miles away, to serve in the household of another lord as a page. The idea was partly educational and partly political. Fostering a child in another family's home created bonds between houses, tied alliances together, and made war between them slightly more awkward. But for the child himself, it meant leaving his mother, his siblings, his familiar rooms, and the smell of his own kitchen, and being handed to strangers. Today a parent might worry about a 7-year-old spending too long on a screen. A medieval parent looked at a 7-year-old and thought, quite seriously, that he seemed old enough to begin preparing for mounted combat. Life as a page was, on the surface, rather civilized. He learned manners. He learned to serve at table, to carve meat properly, to pour wine without embarrassing anyone, to bow, to speak carefully to important people. He learned religion, prayers, sometimes reading and a little Latin. He learned to ride and to hunt and to handle hawks and hounds. He learned music and dancing, because a knight was expected to be presentable in a hall as well as terrifying in a field. It all sounds pleasant enough, almost like an unusually strict boarding school with better horses. But threaded quietly through every single lesson was one persistent message, repeated so often and so casually that it never needed to be spoken aloud. Your value, in the end, depends on whether you can fight. Everything else was decoration. Charming decoration, certainly, but decoration. Even the games pointed in the same direction. Wooden swords were ordinary toys. Boys were encouraged to stage mock battles, to wrestle each other in the courtyard, to test who was strongest and who gave up first. Adults watched these contests with interest and remembered the results. Meanwhile, the qualities we might praise in a child today: Caution, patience, the sensible instinct to step back from something dangerous, received almost no applause at all. Medieval Europe was not accidentally producing warriors. It was running, with remarkable efficiency, a knight factory. And like any good factory, it started with the raw material young and shaped it before it had a chance to set into any other form. The stories helped enormously. Every evening, in halls up and down Europe, boys sat near the fire and listened to tales that were essentially recruitment material dressed up as entertainment. They heard of King Arthur and his knights, of Charlemagne and his paladins, of Roland at the pass, of crusaders who rode into hopeless odds and emerged wrapped in glory rather than regret. They heard of men who were surrounded, outnumbered, wounded, and who somehow won anyway, or who lost so magnificently that people were still singing about it a century later. What they did not hear were the other stories. Nobody gathered children around a fire to tell the thrilling tale of Sir Geoffrey the Reasonably Prepared, who studied the terrain, decided the odds were poor, negotiated a sensible settlement, and lived to a comfortable old age surrounded by grandchildren and functioning knees. That man existed. Many men like him existed. They simply did not get songs. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains a great deal of what follows. The medieval imagination did not survive on averages. It survived on exceptions. It remembered the one man in 100 who charged and won, and quietly forgot the 99 who charged and did not. Every generation of boys grew up with a wildly distorted sample of history, and then built their entire understanding of courage on top of it. By the time a boy reached his early teens, he moved up. The page became a squire, and the training changed character entirely. A squire was attached directly to a knight, and his life became intensely practical. He cared for the horses, which was constant and unglamorous work. He cleaned and maintained weapons, oiled mail against rust, repaired straps, carried equipment. He helped his knight into and out of armour, a process that genuinely required a second pair of hands. He learned the weight of things. He learned how quickly steel dulls, how easily a horse goes lame, how much of warfare is actually logistics and mud and waiting. And crucially, he went with his knight on campaign. This is the detail that changes everything. A squire did not learn about violence from a distance. He rode along, he saw raids, he saw burned villages and the people standing in front of them. He saw wounded men treated in ways that we would rather not describe on a night like this. He may have watched executions. He watched battles from close enough to hear them properly, which is a very different thing from hearing about them. For a boy of 14 or 15, warfare was not a dramatic interruption to ordinary life. It was ordinary life. It was the background scenery of his adolescence. And while all of this was happening, he was absorbing the other lesson, the one that would eventually cause so much trouble. He was learning what reputation meant. A knight's honour was not a private feeling. It was not something he carried around inside himself for personal satisfaction. It was public property. It affected who would ally with him, who would lend him money, who would give him a daughter in marriage, whether the king would trust him with a command, and how his entire family was spoken about in halls he would never visit. Being known as brave could open doors across a kingdom. Being known as a coward could follow a man for 30 years, like a particularly persistent tax collector who also knows where you live. The squire watched this happen around him. He saw men praised and men quietly diminished. He noticed which behaviours produced admiration and which produced that small, awful silence that falls over a room when someone has embarrassed himself. And he drew the obvious conclusion. Caution earned mockery. Boldness earned respect. Recklessness, if it happened to work out, occasionally earned songs. And in a world without recording, without archives, without any reliable way to be remembered, songs were not a trivial reward. Songs were close to immortality. So by the time a young man finally knelt, received his spurs, and rose as a knight, usually somewhere around the age of 20, he had spent more than a decade being carefully and lovingly shaped by a single idea. Glory is worth almost any risk. Not most risks. Almost any. Now take thousands of young men who believe that, in the confident, unshakable way that only the young can believe things. Give them the finest weapons of their age. Give them warhorses bred and trained for aggression. Give them land, income, armed followers, and a social position that depends entirely on being admired, and then let them loose on a continent that had not quite worked out how to govern them. What happens next is not really madness. That is the argument we will be building all night. It looks like madness from where we are sitting, comfortable and warm and unlikely to be challenged to a duel before breakfast. But from the inside, from within that world, almost every decision follows perfectly from the lesson learned in the nursery. The boy learnt that courage mattered most, and what he learnt next, once the spurs were on and the whole world was watching, was considerably more dangerous. He learned that honour was not simply important. Honour was everything, and a man could lose it in an instant over nothing at all at a dinner table in front of people who would remember. So here he stands, 20 years old, or thereabouts. The ceremony is finished, the vows are spoken, the spurs are fastened, and somewhere a priest has blessed a sword that everyone present fully expects to be used. He has a horse worth more than most families would see in a lifetime. He has armour that took a master craftsman months to complete. He has a name, a banner, and a set of expectations resting on his shoulders like a second layer of mail. And he has just been handed the single most dangerous idea in medieval Europe. He has been told that his honour is the most valuable thing he owns. We need to be careful here, because the modern mind hears the word honour and immediately softens it. We think of it as an old-fashioned virtue, something noble and slightly abstract, like integrity or good character. Something a man carries quietly within himself and consults occasionally when making difficult decisions. That is not what honour meant to a medieval knight, not remotely. For him, honour was closer to credit. It was a currency, and a strange one, because it did not sit in a chest or a strongbox. It sat in other people's heads. Its value was set entirely by public opinion, and it could rise or collapse depending on what was said about him in rooms he was not standing in. Think about what that actually meant in practical terms. His honour determined whether a neighbouring lord would join him in a dispute or quietly decline. It determined whether a merchant in a nearby town would extend him credit for a new saddle, a shipment of wine, or the enormous costs of equipping himself for a campaign. It determined whether a father would consider him a suitable match for a daughter, and with her, whatever lands and connections came attached. It determined whether the men who followed him into danger believed he was worth following. Reputation was not the reward for a successful life. Reputation was the machinery that made a successful life possible. And once you understand that, something clicks into place. Because if a man's entire economic, social and political position rests on what people believe about him, then an insult is not a hurt feeling. An insult is an attack on his assets. Imagine a feast. It is one of those long winter evenings in a hall somewhere in Normandy or Kent or Bavaria. The fire is enormous and still not quite enough. There are perhaps 60 people present. Wine has been circulating for some hours, which historically has never made anyone more careful with their words. And another nobleman, a man of roughly equal standing, makes a remark. Perhaps he observes, lightly, that our knight arrived at a certain battle somewhat later than expected. Perhaps he mentions that another man fought rather well that day, and lets the comparison hang in the air without finishing it. Perhaps he says nothing at all, and simply raises an eyebrow at exactly the wrong moment, and half the table sees it. Nothing has technically happened. No blow has been struck. No accusation has been formally made. In our world, this evening ends with someone going home mildly irritated and forgetting about it by Thursday. In his world, that eyebrow may cost him a marriage negotiation. Because the terrible mechanism of honour was this. It did not particularly care whether a thing was true. It cared whether enough people believed it. If a rumour of cowardice took root and was repeated often enough, it became functionally real. It shaped how men treated him. It shaped what was offered to him and what was quietly withheld. There was no court he could appeal to, no correction he could publish, no way to reach into 60 separate memories and revise the record. There was only one available response. He had to demonstrate, publicly and unmistakably, that the suggestion was false. And so arguments escalated. They escalated with a speed that looks almost comical from a distance, until you remember what was actually at stake. A remark became a demand for apology. A refused apology became a challenge. A challenge became a duel, or a raid, or a feud that outlived everyone who had been in the room that night. Noble families sometimes fought each other for decades over disputes that began with a contested inheritance, a disputed boundary stone, a broken betrothal, or an insult that nobody could quite reconstruct afterwards. Entire regions could become genuinely unstable because two powerful men had reached a point where neither could back down without appearing to admit the other was right. And that was the trap. Backing down was not merely embarrassing, it was expensive. Consider the position of a knight who has been insulted and who decides sensibly to let it go. He is not rewarded for his restraint. Nobody says, "How admirably measured." Instead, the interpretation offered by his peers is simpler and far more damaging. He let it go because he could not do otherwise. He let it go because he was afraid. And now everyone has learned something useful about how he responds to pressure, which is exactly the information a rival most wants to have. Meanwhile, the knight who escalates has at least a defence. Whatever the outcome, however ruinous, he can say he was defending his honour, and that phrase functioned almost like a legal justification. It excused a great deal. It made destructive behaviour respectable. The result was a society in which the most mature available option was consistently the least attractive one. The culture rewarded the dramatic response and quietly punished the restrained one, and then expressed surprise when men behaved dramatically. Over time, this produced a genuine distortion in how knights read the world. Because if defending honour is the highest priority, and honour can be threatened by almost anything, then almost anything becomes a threat. A disagreement about a hunting boundary became a matter of honour. A dispute over precedence at a table, over who sat closer to the Lord, over whose banner hung higher, became a matter of honour. A tournament result became a matter of honour. A man looking at another man in a manner that could be described as insolent, if one were inclined to describe it that way, somehow also became a matter of honour, at which point honour had stopped being a virtue and had become something closer to a full-time occupation. A demanding one, with no holidays, no retirement, and a performance review conducted continuously by everyone you had ever met. And here is where it becomes genuinely tragic, rather than merely absurd. Because a man in that position cannot ever rest. His honour is not a possession he has secured. It is a claim he must keep renewing. Every year, every gathering, every campaign, the question is asked again, and last year's answer does not count. Now, we should be fair to these men, because it would be easy to spend 8 hours mocking them and miss what is actually interesting. The honour culture was not pure vanity. It performed a real function in a world with very weak central authority. Medieval kingdoms had limited bureaucracy, limited policing, and courts whose judgments were often difficult to enforce against a powerful man with a castle and 300 armed followers. In that environment, reputation did a great deal of the work that law does for us. A man known to retaliate fiercely was less likely to be robbed, cheated, or encroached upon. His reputation was his security system. Seen that way, the fierce reaction to a small insult is not irrational at all. It is deterrence. It is a man maintaining the credibility of a threat, because the day that threat stops being credible is the day his neighbours start moving fences. The problem, of course, is that a system built on deterrence has no natural stopping point. If reputation is maintained by response, and every rival is also maintaining his reputation by response, then the whole society is locked into a competition where nobody can afford to be the first to show restraint. It is a spiral, and it ran for centuries. The church noticed, kings noticed, chroniclers noticed and complained at length, in tones ranging from disapproval to open exhaustion. There were attempts to control it. There were courts of chivalry, royal prohibitions, ecclesiastical condemnations, and periodic royal edicts forbidding private warfare, which were obeyed with roughly the enthusiasm you would expect. Because a knight who was told by a distant monarch that he must not pursue his quarrel faced a straightforward calculation. The king was far away and busy. His rival was near and laughing. And there was one other pressure working on all of this, which we should name before we move on. These men were young. We picture knights as grizzled veterans, but the median knight at any given moment was a man in his 20s, at an age when the human capacity for calm risk assessment is not, historically, at its peak. He was surrounded by other men in their 20s, all of whom were watching him, all of whom were also desperate not to be the one who flinched. Put 100 such men in a hall with wine and old grievances and a system that rewards boldness, and the outcome is not really mysterious. So the honour culture created a class of men who could not ignore an insult, could not withdraw from a challenge, could not admit error, and could not rest on any past achievement. Every day was a fresh examination, and the examiners were everyone they knew. What that culture needed, urgently, was somewhere for all of it to go. Some structured, sanctioned, spectacular arena where a young man could prove his courage in front of the largest possible audience, win money, attract attention, embarrass his rivals, and settle absolutely nothing of any practical importance whatsoever. And medieval Europe, being nothing if not accommodating to its warrior class, invented exactly that. They called it the tournament. And it would turn out to be one of the most effective institutions ever devised for persuading thousands of ambitious young noblemen that extremely dangerous behaviour was, on balance, an excellent idea. If honour was the fuel that powered the medieval knight, the tournament was the engine that burned through it at a truly alarming rate. Say the word tournament to a modern listener and a rather pleasant image assembles itself. Colourful pavilions. Pennants fluttering. 2 riders approaching each other along a barrier at a stately pace, while a crowd applauds politely. Someone is unhorsed, rolls dramatically, stands up, bows, and goes off to have his shoulder looked at. There are rules. There are officials. There is, one assumes, someone in the background with bandages and a sensible attitude. That image is not entirely wrong. It is simply about 300 years too late. The tournaments of the 12th century, when the whole institution was at its wildest, would be almost unrecognisable to anyone raised on the tidy jousts of film and pageantry. A more honest description would be this: large groups of heavily armed noblemen assembling in open countryside to fight each other across several square miles of farmland, for money, for reputation, and for reasons that nobody involved could satisfactorily explain to the farmers whose crops were being ridden into the ground. And here is the detail that surprises people. Tournaments did not begin as entertainment at all. They began as training. Cavalry warfare in the medieval period was not simply a matter of individual bravery. A charge only worked if a group of men could hold formation at speed, keep their spacing, commit at the same moment, and then regroup afterwards, instead of scattering across the landscape in 100 separate directions. That is difficult. It requires practice, and it requires practice with other riders, on real ground, at real speed, in conditions confusing enough to resemble the thing itself. So knights gathered to rehearse. They practiced riding together, wheeling together, charging together, breaking off and reforming. It was, in origin, a professional exercise, a way of keeping expensive military skills from rusting during the periods when nobody happened to be at war. The difficulty arose almost immediately, and it is one of the most human developments in the whole story. The knights discovered that they enjoyed the fighting rather more than they enjoyed the training, and once that preference took hold, the tournament began drifting steadily away from its original purpose. It stopped being a rehearsal and started being an event. Word spread when one was planned. People came. And not only knights. The crowds were extraordinary. Thousands might attend a well-publicised tournament. Great nobles arrived with their households. Lesser lords came to be seen alongside greater ones. Merchants came because crowds mean money, and set up stalls selling food, drink, cloth, and equipment. Armourers and smiths came because armour breaks and horses throw shoes, and both of these facts are excellent for business. Clergy came, officially to disapprove, and unofficially because it was the most interesting thing happening for 50 miles. Peasants from surrounding villages came to watch their social superiors fall off horses, which has always been one of humanity's more reliable entertainments. And the knights, standing in the middle of all this, understood exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at an audience. The rewards on offer were not abstract. A successful tournament knight could become genuinely wealthy, and the mechanism by which this happened is one of the most revealing details of the entire period. Because in the older, wilder tournaments, the primary way to profit was not by winning a prize. It was by capturing your opponents. A defeated knight was, by custom, obliged to surrender his horse and armour to the man who had beaten him, or to pay a ransom to redeem them. And since a war horse and a full harness represented an enormous investment, the sums involved were serious. A skilled fighter with a good eye for isolating opponents could ride onto a field with almost nothing and ride off having stripped several wealthy young men of their most valuable possessions. This turned the tournament into something genuinely strange. It was simultaneously a sport, a military exercise, a social occasion, a marriage market, and a highly aggressive form of asset transfer. The greatest and most dangerous form of the tournament was the melee, and this is where the modern image breaks down completely. A melee was not two men at a barrier. It was two teams, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, fighting across open ground that might stretch for miles and include woods, streams, villages, hedgerows, and any other terrain that happened to be lying about. There were designated safe areas where an exhausted man could retreat, catch his breath, have a strap prepared, and then plunge back in. Beyond that, the structure was minimal. Men charged with lances. When the lances broke, and they broke almost immediately, they fought with swords and maces. They wrestled opponents out of the saddle. They pursued fleeing rivals across fields. Groups formed and dissolved. Friends fought together deliberately, cooperating to isolate wealthy targets, which was less chivalrous than the song suggested, but considerably more profitable. Contemporary observers occasionally struggled to describe the difference between a melee and an actual battle, because in the honest moments there was not much of one. The weapons were sometimes blunted, sometimes not. The intent was capture rather than killing, but intent is a fragile thing at the moment when a horse is going down beneath you and someone is swinging at your head. Injuries were routine. Broken bones. Crushed hands and feet, which happened constantly, because armoured men fall from horses and other horses do not always notice. Concussions. In an age with no understanding whatsoever of what repeated head trauma does to a person over 20 years. Suffocation, which sounds unlikely until you consider a man face down in mud inside a closed helm with a horse standing on his back. And deaths, regularly enough that the church spent the better part of 2 centuries formally condemning tournaments and threatening participants with denial of Christian burial. The condemnation had approximately the effect you would expect on a population of young men who had been raised to believe that public displays of courage were the foundation of their entire social existence. Armour helped, and armour improved dramatically across the centuries precisely because of this constant pressure. But armour could never entirely compensate for the underlying arrangement, which was that several dozen men weighing perhaps 20 stone each once mounted were galloping toward each other across uneven ground while carrying implements designed to break things. And here is the part that reveals everything about the culture. The danger did not reduce the tournament's appeal. The danger was the appeal, because prestige is only generated by risk. If a thing is safe, doing it proves nothing. The entire value of tournament success came from the fact that people were genuinely getting hurt, and that a man who performed well had visibly chosen to accept that. The greater the danger, the greater the glory available. A cautious knight might well survive the day intact and go home with his horse in his teeth, but he would not be talked about that evening, and he would not be talked about the following year. A reckless one might become a legend, or a cautionary tale, frequently both, in the same lifetime depending on which decade you asked about. And so a peculiar sort of career emerged. Certain knights became, in every meaningful sense, professional tournament athletes. They travelled constantly, following the circuit across northern France, Flanders, the German lands, and England wherever a tournament had been proclaimed. They developed reputations, they accumulated followings. They were recruited by great lords who wanted their household associated with a celebrated fighter, in much the same way and for much the same reasons that a wealthy patron might sponsor a champion today. Some grew rich doing this. The most famous of them rose from being a landless younger son with nothing but skill and nerve to being one of the most powerful men in England, an advisor to kings, and eventually regent of a kingdom. That happened. The tournament was, genuinely, a ladder, but for every man who climbed it, there were a great many who fell off. Because the costs were ferocious. A tournament knight needed multiple horses, because horses were injured, killed, captured, or simply exhausted. He needed armour maintained and repaired constantly. He needed grooms, armourers, servants, and pack animals. He needed to travel, which meant food and lodging for a small household. He needed to look impressive on arrival, because arriving looking shabby undermined the entire enterprise. And so knights borrowed. They borrowed against future ransoms they had not yet won. They borrowed against lands they had not yet inherited. They mortgaged property to fund a season of competition, on the assumption that success would repay it, which is a calculation that has ended badly for enthusiastic young men in every century since. Some ruined themselves entirely. There are records of men who lost estates that their families had held for generations, in pursuit of a reputation that would last perhaps a decade and be forgotten within 2. And they did this knowingly. That is what makes it so revealing. These were not stupid men. They could count. They understood that the arithmetic was against them. But they had been raised inside a system where being spoken of well was not a luxury but the foundation of everything else, and where a man without reputation was a man without allies, without credit, and without prospects. So they kept going. And somewhere in that process, for a great many of them, the relationship to glory changed character entirely. It stopped being something they pursued. It became something they required. A knight who has built his entire identity around being admired cannot simply stop being admired and carry on as before. The admiration is now load-bearing. Remove it, and the whole structure sags. That hunger did not stay politely confined to the tournament field. It followed these men home. It followed them into their disputes with neighbours, into their dealings with their own tenants, into their calculations on real battlefields where the stakes were considerably higher and the opponents had no interest whatsoever in ransoms. Because the tournament had taught them something that would prove very difficult to unlearn. It had taught them that the crowd was always watching, that hesitation was visible, and that the man who committed hardest was the man everyone remembered. And that lesson, carried out of the lists and into the world, was about to make life extremely complicated. Not only for the knights themselves, but for a great many people who had never asked to be part of anyone's reputation. By now our knight has spent years chasing honour and proving himself in the lists. He has been unhorsed and got up again. He has captured men and been captured. He has heard his name called out by a herald in front of a crowd, and felt whatever it is that a young man feels in that moment. And he has run directly into the central problem of his entire way of life. The proving never stops. This is the trap, and it is worth spending some time inside it, because it explains more medieval behaviour than almost anything else. A knight could win 10 battles. He could dominate 20 tournaments. He could receive praise from a king in front of the assembled nobility of a kingdom. And a single hesitation, witnessed by the wrong people at the wrong moment, could undo a meaningful portion of it. Medieval society had many admirable qualities. Generous forgiveness of perceived weakness was not among them. Think about what a strange psychological position that creates. In most professions, past achievement accumulates. A reputation for competence is built up over years and then draws interest, protecting you during the inevitable bad seasons. A surgeon with 20 successful years is not undone by one difficult case. A scholar with a shelf of respected work is not erased by one weak paper. Honour did not accumulate that way. Honour behaved less like savings and more like a performance that had to be repeated nightly, before an audience that had seen it all before and was therefore harder to impress each time. So the knight lived under a permanent expectation of courage, not situational courage. Not courage when the odds were reasonable and the cause was good. Always, if a dangerous mission was proposed, he was expected to volunteer, and to volunteer promptly, because the man who volunteers second has revealed something about the man who volunteered first. If challenged, he was expected to respond. If a battle looked unpromising, he was expected to ride into it anyway, and to look untroubled while doing so. The sentence, "This seems unnecessary and likely to kill several of us," was technically available. It simply never generated applause. Many knights, therefore, lived inside a state of continuous performance. Every hall was a stage. Every campaign was an examination. Every conversation among peers contained an element of assessment, because these men judged one another constantly and with enormous attention to detail. They noticed who spoke first and who waited. They noticed who rode at the front of a column and who drifted comfortably toward the middle. They noticed everything, and they remembered it, and they discussed it later. His companions might forgive a defeat. Defeat happened to everyone, and could be attributed to numbers, ground, weather, or the incompetence of an ally, which was a perennial favourite. They might forgive bad luck, and medieval warfare produced bad luck in industrial quantities. What they found nearly impossible to forgive, and impossible to forget, was the appearance of fear. Note the word appearance, not the thing itself. Because everybody was afraid. Anyone who has ever read a medieval account written by someone who was actually present, rather than someone composing verse about it 40 years later, will find fear everywhere. Men prayed before battles with real desperation. They confessed. They made wills. They wept. They forgave old enemies in the hours before dawn, which is not the behaviour of men who felt nothing. The requirement was never to be fearless. It was to be seen behaving as though you were. And that distinction is exactly what makes the whole system so ruinous. A society that demanded genuine fearlessness would have failed immediately, since fearlessness is not available to human beings under those conditions. A society that demands the visible appearance of fearlessness, however, can run indefinitely, because appearance is achievable. A frightened man can still ride forward. He can still keep his voice level. He can still refuse an offered retreat. He simply cannot use his fear as information. This is the crucial loss. Fear is not an inconvenience. Fear is a functioning instrument. It is the part of a man that notices the ground is bad, the flanks are open, the enemy has chosen this position for a reason, and that the whole arrangement smells wrong. It is, in effect, a rapid risk assessment delivered directly into the body. A culture that treats every expression of that instrument as shameful has not created brave men. It has created men who have been forbidden to consult one of their better sources of information. And once you see it in those terms, a great many otherwise baffling decisions in medieval history become uncomfortably legible. Knights launched attacks against clearly superior forces because withdrawal would have been humiliating, and the humiliation was. in their reckoning, the more permanent damage. Men accepted duels they had very little chance of surviving, because refusing would have marked them in front of people whose opinion determined their family's future. Commanders remained in hopeless positions long after any sensible reading of the situation had packed its things and left. Because to be the man who ordered the retreat was to be the man who ordered the retreat. And that follows you. The pressure fell hardest, as it always does, on the young. An older knight, if he lived long enough, sometimes acquired a quiet and hard-won scepticism. He had seen glorious charges before, and he had helped carry the results back afterwards. He had watched a friend die achieving nothing whatsoever, and he had noticed that no song was written about it. His reputation was already established, which gave him a small margin of freedom. He could counsel caution and be heard as experienced rather than timid. A 20-year-old had no such margin. He had nothing established. His entire reputation was still hypothetical, and he was surrounded by other young men in exactly the same position, all of whom were watching to see who would move first. Put a veteran and a young knight in front of the same difficult situation and you get two entirely different readings of it. The veteran sees a bad position, an exposed flank, and a well-chosen enemy line, and thinks that he has seen enough fields to know how this one ends. The young knight sees the same ground and thinks with genuine sincerity that this is precisely the sort of moment men are remembered for. History has preserved a great many examples of both. It has preserved rather more examples of the second, partly because the second produces better stories, and partly because the second produces more casualties, and casualties get recorded. And the literature made all of it worse. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves proper attention, because the relationship between medieval men and their own entertainment was genuinely peculiar. The romances and chansons that filled noble halls were full of heroic last stands, impossible victories, and warriors who never wavered. Roland at Roncesvalles, refusing to sound his horn for help until it was far too late, is the perfect specimen. A man dies, along with the entire rearguard of an army, essentially because calling for assistance would have looked like fear. And that story was not told as a warning, it was told as an ideal. Boys were meant to admire it. Now, medieval audiences were not naive. They knew perfectly well that Arthur's court was not a historical record, and that dragons did not require serious contingency planning. But there is a difference between believing a story literally and being shaped by it, and it is the second that does the damage. The romances did not teach knights that magic existed. They taught them what a good death looked like. They taught them the shape of an admirable life, the rhythm of a worthy career, the sort of moment that justifies everything preceding it. And men absorbed that shape, and then went looking for situations that matched it. Nobody, as we noted, composes epic verse about the lord who examined the ground carefully, opened negotiations, secured reasonable terms, and rode home with every one of his men and all of his limbs. That man saved dozens of lives. He has no song. His descendants do not tell stories about him at dinner. From the perspective of the culture that produced him, he barely happened. So, the whole apparatus, the childhood training, the honour economy, the tournament circuit, the constant surveillance of peers, and the literature that supplied the ideal converged on a single outcome. It produced a class of men for whom appearing fearless had become nearly as important as remaining alive, and in certain moments, rather more important. And when a man spends 20 years performing fearlessness in front of an audience that never stops watching, something eventually happens that is worth pausing on. He starts to believe it. Not all of them. Some retained a private clarity about the difference between the performance and the reality, and those men tended to live longer. But a proportion of them lost the distinction altogether. The performance stopped being something they put on and became something they were. And a man in that condition is genuinely dangerous, first to himself and then to everybody riding behind him, because he has ceased to be able to assess a situation at all. He can only assess how a situation would look in a song. That was the condition of the medieval warrior class at its most extreme. Trained from 7, judged from 12, performing from 20, forbidden to consult their own fear, surrounded by stories that rewarded exactly the behaviour most likely to kill them. And into that already combustible arrangement, in the closing years of the 11th century, something new arrived. Something that took every incentive already operating on these men and multiplied it by a factor no earthly reward could match. Because up to this point, everything on offer had been temporary. Fame fades. Land is inherited by someone else. Songs are eventually sung about newer men. Then the church stepped forward and offered these warriors something permanent. If tournaments persuaded knights to risk their lives for glory, religion arrived and offered them something considerably harder to argue with. It offered eternal glory. We should begin by setting aside a very common assumption, which is that medieval religious devotion was mostly performance, or mostly politics, or mostly a convenient cover for men who wanted to do what they were going to do anyway. Some of it certainly was, but the overwhelming impression left by the surviving evidence, by wills and charters and letters and the sheer quantity of money poured into monasteries by men who could have spent it on themselves, is that most medieval nobles believed, deeply, anxiously, and with a specificity that is difficult for a modern listener to reconstruct. They believed that God observed human affairs directly and intervened in them. They believed that the soul was real, that judgment was coming, and that the arrangements made in this life would determine an outcome lasting forever. Forever was not a figure of speech to them. It was a duration, and they thought about it, which produced for the knightly class an extremely uncomfortable contradiction. Christianity, as presented to them from the pulpit, valued peace, humility, forgiveness, mercy, and the turning of the other cheek. It contained a commandment about killing that was not ambiguous. It held up as its central figure a man who had explicitly declined to be defended by force. And the knights, meanwhile, spent their working lives hitting people with metal. Reconciling these two facts had always been awkward. The church had spent centuries trying with limited success and had produced a variety of partial solutions. There were penances imposed on men who killed in battle, sometimes lengthy ones, even when the war was considered just. There were the movements known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which attempted to fence off certain people and certain days from violence, and to which we will return. There was a general clerical attitude toward the warrior aristocracy that hovered somewhere between necessary tolerance and open despair. The knights themselves felt this tension. That is the important part. A great many of them arrived at middle age with a genuine and growing unease about the arithmetic of their own souls. They endowed monasteries. They funded chantries where monks would pray for them after death. They took the habit in their final illness, hoping to die technically as monks. These are not the actions of men who felt comfortable. And then, in the last decade of the 11th century, a solution appeared that seemed to dissolve the entire problem at once. In the year 1095, at Clermont in central France, Pope Urban II addressed a council and called for an armed expedition to the east. The details of what he actually said are disputed, since the surviving accounts were written afterwards by men who had every reason to shape the record. But the essential offer was understood clearly enough by those who heard it, and by the many thousands who heard about it in the following months. This was not merely a war. It was framed as a sacred undertaking. Participation carried spiritual reward. A man who went, and who went with the right intention, could expect the remission of penance owed for his sins. For the knightly class, this was a development of extraordinary significance, and it is worth being precise about why. Before this, a knight's central skill and his spiritual welfare pulled in opposite directions. Every year he practiced his profession was, in a sense, a year of accumulating debt. Now, suddenly, the two were aligned. He could ride, he could fight, he could win renown, he could capture booty, he could see distant lands, and he could improve rather than endanger his eternal position. It was almost as though someone had designed a religious movement with the specific interests of heavily armed noblemen in mind. The response was overwhelming, and its scale still surprises people who study it properly. Men sold land. Men mortgaged land to monasteries, which is one reason the surviving documentation is so rich, since monastic archives preserved these transactions carefully. Men borrowed at ruinous terms. Entire families committed resources accumulated over generations. Some lords went accompanied by their brothers, their sons, and much of their household, leaving estates in the hands of wives and stewards for years at a time. And then they walked. That detail deserves emphasis, because the maps make it look tidy, and it was not. The journey to the Holy Land from northern France was something in the order of 2,000 miles overland. It crossed the Alps or the Balkans, passed through territories with unfamiliar languages, hostile populations, unreliable food supplies, and diseases against which nobody had any defence at all. The chronicles of the First Crusade contain passages that are genuinely difficult to read. Armies ran out of water in the Anatolian summer, and men died in sight of one another. Horses died in such numbers that knights, the entire meaning of whose social identity rested on being mounted, ended up walking, and in some cases riding oxen, which the chroniclers record with a kind of stunned embarrassment. At the siege of Antioch, the besiegers ran out of food while besieging a city that had food, which is the sort of reversal that no song had prepared anyone for. Famine reached a point that the sources describe in terms we will not go into on a night intended for sleep. Entire contingents perished before ever reaching the destination. Not in battle. From thirst, hunger, dysentery, and exhaustion, and a remarkable number of the survivors kept going. Some of that persistence was faith. It is easy to be cynical at a distance of 900 years, but the accounts describe men who had lost everything and who continued because they believed they were participating in something that mattered beyond their own survival. When they found what they took to be a holy relic at Antioch, the effect on morale was enormous and immediate, and there is no sensible way to explain that except that they meant it. But faith was not the only thing pulling them forward, and the medieval sources are far more honest about this than we sometimes expect. Prestige was pulling too, and pulling hard, because a crusader who came home transformed. A tournament victory made a man known in his region. A campaign in a neighbour's territory made him known in his kingdom. But a man who had been to Jerusalem was known throughout Christendom. He had a story that nobody in his hall could match, and that story attached itself to his family permanently. Descendants referred to it for generations. It appeared in charters, it shaped marriages, it sat behind a family's standing for a century. For an ambitious young man weighing his options, the calculation was not subtle. There was simply nothing else available that offered so much. And this is where the whole arrangement becomes genuinely dangerous, because it introduced into an already overconfident warrior class a new and very powerful idea. Divine approval. If a man believes God favours his enterprise, certain kinds of reasoning stop functioning. Unfavourable odds become a test of faith rather than a warning. Sound military advice becomes evidence of insufficient conviction. Victory, when it comes, is taken as confirmation that every decision leading to it was correct, including the reckless ones, and defeat, when it comes, is attributed not to poor planning but to sin within the army, which means the remedy is spiritual rather than tactical. That last mechanism deserves attention, because it is remarkably resistant to correction. A belief that cannot be disproved by failure is a belief that will keep producing failures. Some crusaders became convinced that they could not lose while they remained in a state of grace. Some interpreted every fortunate accident as an intervention. A few developed a confidence that reality was going to have real difficulty accommodating. And reality, as it repeatedly demonstrated across 2 centuries of campaigning in the East, was not impressed. Arrows do not evaluate the spiritual condition of the man they strike. Dysentery has no theology. Water shortages in high summer are indifferent to the sincerity of anyone's vows. Horses that have been ridden 3,000 miles do not respond to encouragement. The men who did best in the East were, unsurprisingly, the ones who learned. The settlers who stayed on and founded the Crusader states adapted quickly. They adopted lighter equipment, local tactics, careful water discipline, and a diplomatic flexibility that scandalized newly arrived enthusiasts from Europe. They negotiated with Muslim neighbours, made truces, traded, and generally behaved like men who had discovered that survival required more than conviction. And the newcomers, arriving fresh from Europe with all the confidence of men who had heard the songs, frequently regarded these veterans as compromised, insufficiently zealous, and in need of correction. The disasters that followed from that attitude are among the most instructive in the whole period. Men who had lived in the region for 30 years advised against marching across waterless ground in July. Men who had arrived in March insisted. The results were consistent. So the crusading movement did not create the medieval knight's recklessness. It found it already fully developed and gave it a theological justification and an unlimited horizon. Before the Crusades, a knight risked his life for land, for ransom, for the good opinion of a few hundred people. Afterwards, he could risk it for something that never ended. And once a man has been told that both his society and heaven are urging him forward, caution has almost nothing left to appeal to. It cannot offer safety, because safety has been redefined as shameful. It cannot offer reason, because reason has been outranked. It can only ask him to be the one person in the column who says stop, and that request has never persuaded very many people. Yet for all the intensity of the crusading period, something else was happening back in Europe that would prove just as revealing about the knightly character. Because the Crusades came and went, and in between them and around them, and often instead of them, there were long stretches when there was simply no war available at all. And it turned out that this was, for a great many knights, the most difficult condition of all. For some medieval knights, war was a necessity. For others, it became a habit. And for a genuinely surprising number of them, it looked less like a duty and more like a hobby that had got badly out of hand. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe contained thousands of men whose entire identity had been assembled around fighting. They had spent childhood learning it, adolescence practicing it, and adulthood acquiring status through it. Everything they owned, everything they were called, and everything their families expected of them rested on that single capacity. And then, periodically, peace happened. Not permanent peace. Medieval Europe never managed that. But there were stretches, sometimes years at a time, when a region had no major campaign, no royal summons, no legitimate outlet whatsoever, for several hundred highly trained and extremely expensive men who had been raised to believe that fighting was the point of their existence. This created a problem that nobody in the period ever fully solved. A knight without a war was in an awkward position. His skill still existed, his horses still ate, his household still expected to be fed and rewarded. His young followers, who had attached themselves to him precisely because he offered a route to reputation and profit, were still standing about in his hall waiting for something to happen. A modern athlete whose career ends can retrain, take up commentary, open a business, or discover golf. A medieval knight in the same position looked around the horizon for the nearest available conflict, and if he could not find one within a reasonable distance, a certain number of them simply made one. Contemporary writers noticed this and complained about it repeatedly. Chroniclers observed that during quiet periods, raiding increased. Private feuds resurfaced. Disputes that had been dormant for a decade acquired sudden urgency. Bands of knights and their retainers rode out to settle matters with neighbours over boundaries, tolls, rights of pasture, mill privileges, and grievances that had been perfectly tolerable while there was a proper war on. It was, in effect, energy seeking an outlet, and finding one locally. The church tried to intervene, and the attempt is one of the more revealing episodes of the period. From the late 10th century onwards, a movement developed that historians call the Peace of God, followed by the Truce of God. The first attempted to place certain categories of people permanently off limits to knightly violence, clergy, pilgrims, merchants, peasants working their fields, and to protect churches, mills and livestock. The second attempted to restrict fighting by time, forbidding it on Sundays, then on Fridays, then on the major feasts, then during Lent and Advent, until in some regions the theoretically permitted days of warfare had been reduced to a fairly narrow window in the middle of the week. Assemblies were held, oaths were sworn on relics, excommunication was threatened against those who broke them. And what this tells us, more than anything, is that church leaders had reached a point of essentially standing before the assembled nobility of a region and requesting, in the most solemn terms available to them, that these men consider not attacking people for at least part of the week. The fact that such a proposal was considered necessary and considered ambitious is more informative than any chronicle passage could be. Now we should be fair here, because it would be easy to present this as pure bloodthirstiness, and it was not. The pressures involved were real, and two of them deserve proper attention. The first was economic. Maintaining knightly status was ruinously expensive, and the expense did not pause during peacetime. A knight needed war horses, and a war horse was among the most costly single items in the medieval economy, worth many times an ordinary riding animal and requiring specialised feed and constant attention. He needed armour, which wore out and required maintenance and periodic replacement as fashions and technologies shifted. He needed weapons, servants, grooms, a household to feed, and a standard of hospitality to maintain, because a lord who fed his guests badly acquired a reputation that closed doors. And his income came from land, which produced roughly the same amount every year regardless of his ambitions, and which was frequently divided among heirs, and which was vulnerable to bad harvests, disease, and weather. Warfare, by contrast, was potentially profitable. There was plunder. There was ransom, which for a captured nobleman could be enormous and life-changing. There was the possibility of a grant of land from a grateful lord, which was the only real route to permanent advancement. There was, for the fortunate, the chance of an advantageous marriage arranged on the strength of a reputation earned on campaign. Peace offered none of this. Peace offered the same income, the same expenses, and no upside whatsoever. For a younger son with no inheritance, and medieval Europe produced enormous numbers of these, the calculation was even starker. He had been trained as a knight, equipped as a knight, and had absolutely no land coming to him. His entire prospect of ever having an estate, a wife, or a household of his own depended on a war occurring within his useful lifetime. Give a continent several thousand such men, all armed, all trained, all in their 20s, all with nothing to lose and no legitimate route to gain, and the outcome is not really a mystery, it is arithmetic. The second pressure was psychological, and here we should be honest about something the sources make quite clear. A great many knights simply enjoyed it. Not the suffering, not the dying, but the rest of it. The intensity, the companionship, the sense of consequence. Battle offered danger, purpose, and the particular closeness that comes from having been somewhere terrible alongside specific other people. It offered the chance to be the version of yourself that everyone had always said you might be. It turned ordinary men into figures worth discussing, or at least gave them a chance to try. There is a well-known lyric from the period, attributed to a southern French nobleman, expressing straightforward delight at the sight of an army in the field, at the noise, at the confusion, at armed men trampling through the countryside. Modern readers usually find it shocking. It was not written to shock. It was written by a man describing what he found beautiful. Set against that, the alternative was estate management. And estate management was, and remains, unglamorous. A lord at peace spent his time hearing disputes between tenants, checking accounts, overseeing repairs to mills and barns, arguing with a neighbouring abbey about fishing rights, and adjudicating quarrels of extraordinary pettiness. Manorial court records survive in large numbers, and they are full of exactly this. Trespassing pigs, unauthorised woodcutting, someone's wall, someone else's ditch. Imagine spending your entire childhood and adolescence being prepared for dramatic acts of courage in front of an admiring world, and then discovering that your most pressing responsibility this month is establishing who rightfully owns 3 goats and the disputed half of a field. Some men adapted well to this, it should be said clearly, because the reckless ones dominate the record and skew our impression. Plenty of knights became competent administrators, careful landlords, and thoughtful heads of household. They built, they founded chapels, they arranged good marriages for their daughters. They died in bed, at a reasonable age, having caused nobody any particular trouble. They are, of course, almost entirely absent from the exciting sources, which is precisely the distortion we keep encountering. But a significant minority never adapted at all, and these men went looking. Some travelled to foreign wars. The Baltic Crusades became, in the 14th century, an almost fashionable destination for Western knights who wanted campaigning experience and religious credit in a package that could be completed in a single season. Others took service with foreign princes, others joined the great mercenary companies that emerged in the 14th century. Professional bands who sold their services to Italian cities and, in the gaps between contracts, extorted money from the same cities under threat of doing what they did best. And many embraced crusading precisely because it provided an acceptable, indeed praiseworthy, outlet for exactly the impulses their own society had spent centuries cultivating and then attempting to restrain. The result was a warrior class that tended to regard peace not as an achievement, but as an interval, something to be waited out, a gap in the record rather than the goal of everything else. And a class of men who regard peace as an interruption will, given sufficient time and sufficient idleness, find things to do. Which brings us to the most reliable source of medieval entertainment available to a bored nobleman with armed followers and unresolved feelings. His neighbours. Because if a knight could not find a war, he was frequently entirely capable of manufacturing one, and he rarely had to travel far to do it. The enemy was usually within a day's ride, held similar views about honour, had a comparable number of retainers, and could very probably remember an incident from 12 years ago involving a hunting party and a disputed stag. Modern disputes between neighbours involve fences, parking, noise, and occasionally a strongly worded letter. Medieval noble disputes involved armed retainers, burned barns, seized cattle, and enough mutual resentment to keep 3 generations meaningfully occupied. And once such a quarrel began, it had an unfortunate tendency to grow far beyond the 2 men who started it. A feud could begin almost anywhere. That is the first thing to understand about them, and the most unsettling. A disputed inheritance, a contested boundary, a marriage agreement broken, or fulfilled badly, or fulfilled in a way that one family later decided had been insulting. A hunting party that crossed into the wrong woods, a debt acknowledged and then not repaid, a remark at a wedding, a precedence dispute over who entered a church first. 2 powerful men who met, disliked one another immediately, and spent the following 40 years confirming that first impression. Any of these could serve as a beginning, and the choice of beginning frequently had very little to do with how large the thing eventually became. The underlying reason lies in something we have not yet examined properly, and it is essential to the whole picture. Medieval justice for most of the period, and in most of Europe, was weak. Not absent. There were courts. There were laws, customs, written codes, assemblies and judges. There were kings who genuinely tried to impose order and occasionally succeeded for a generation or 2. But the machinery that we take entirely for granted, a police force capable of arresting a wealthy man, a prosecution service independent of the parties, an enforcement arm able to compel a great lord to comply with a verdict he dislikes, largely did not exist. Which meant that a court judgment against a powerful man was, in practice, a strongly worded opinion. Consider the position of a knight who believes he has been genuinely wronged. His neighbour has seized a mill that his family has held for 3 generations. He can certainly take the matter to court, but the court may be presided over by someone connected to the neighbour by marriage. The neighbour may have more armed followers. Even if the judgment goes his way, someone must physically go and take the mill back, and that someone will be him. So a great many nobles concluded, not unreasonably, that the legal route was a formality to be observed on the way to the practical route. And the practical route involved gathering men. This is where a private quarrel begins its expansion. Because a knight who gathers men does not gather strangers. He calls on relatives, on tenants who owe him service, on younger sons of neighbouring families who owe him favours or hope to earn them, on friends who fought beside him in an earlier campaign. Every one of those men has his own relatives and his own obligations. His opponent does exactly the same. Within a season, a dispute between two individuals has become a conflict involving perhaps a dozen families across a region. And here is the mechanism that made feuds so nearly impossible to end. Once a man on either side has been killed, injured, or humiliated, his family now has a grievance of its own, independent of the original quarrel. They are no longer participating on someone else's behalf. They have their own reason. Multiply that across several years, and the number of separate grievances in circulation exceeds the number of people capable of remembering what any of them were about. The chroniclers noticed this and remarked on it with some exasperation. Feuds ran for decades in which the original cause had become genuinely obscure to the participants, yet everyone remained entirely committed to continuation. One generation began it, the next inherited it, the way they inherited land and armour and a family name. Their children inherited it in turn. There are documented cases of men risking their lives and losing them over disputes that had begun before they were born, against families they had never had a personal disagreement with, for reasons that had been settled in principle twice already and had restarted both times over the terms of the settlement. And to those involved, this was not madness, it was obligation. That distinction matters, and we should sit with it, because it is the heart of the whole knight's argument. The logic ran like this. Honour demanded that a wrong be avenged. Vengeance protected reputation. Reputation protected status. Status protected the family's lands, its marriages, its alliances, and ultimately its ability to protect anyone at all. It is circular. It is also, given the world these men actually lived in, not obviously wrong. A family known to absorb injuries without response was a family that would receive more injuries. The feud was not merely emotional. It was, in a grim way, insurance. Castles complicated everything further. We tend to imagine castles as royal fortresses, great national strongholds sitting on hills to defend kingdoms. Many were nothing of the kind. Enormous numbers of castles across Europe were private buildings erected by individual lords, garrisoned by their own followers, and intended primarily for use in local quarrels. A castle changed the arithmetic of a feud entirely. A man who felt threatened could withdraw behind walls, bring his livestock inside, stock his stores, and wait. His enemies could not simply overwhelm him. They would need siege equipment, supplies, and the willingness to sit outside for weeks or months while their own lands went unwatched, which turned local disagreements into military operations of genuine duration. Picture it in modern terms, and the absurdity is difficult to avoid. You have a dispute with the man who lives down the road. Your response is to lock yourself inside a fortified stone structure while your armed supporters assemble in the surrounding fields. And both parties settle in for a campaign that may outlast the summer. Medieval Europe operated on this principle with remarkable regularity, and the situation was serious enough that kings across several centuries repeatedly attempted to control the building of castles. Licenses were required. Unlicensed fortifications were ordered demolished. In England after the Civil War of the 12th century, a substantial programme of destruction was undertaken specifically to reduce the number of private strongholds in circulation. The frequency with which such measures were reissued tells you approximately how well they worked. Some knights became so notorious for private warfare that even determined monarchs struggled to restrain them. There is a recurring pattern in the records. A king issues an order demanding peace between two families. The order is received. It is acknowledged with every appearance of respect. And then, everyone involved discovers that heavily armed nobles were remarkably selective about which royal instructions they treated as urgent, particularly when the king was 300 miles away dealing with something else. The German lands were the extreme case. The Holy Roman Empire's fragmented authority produced a formally recognised institution of private warfare, in which a nobleman could legally declare a feud against another provided he observed the correct procedures, including a formal written declaration delivered in advance. Imperial authorities spent centuries attempting to regulate, restrict, and eventually abolish it. The final prohibition did not arrive until the very end of the 15th century, and even then compliance was, let us say, uneven. The consequences fell, as they always do, mostly on people who had no part in the quarrel. This is the part the songs left out entirely. When two noble houses feuded, the actual fighting between knights was often limited. Armoured men were valuable and difficult to kill, and both sides had strong incentives to capture rather than slay one another, since a captured enemy was worth money, and a dead one was worth a permanent escalation. So the war was conducted against the other side's economy. That meant burning villages, it meant driving off cattle, it meant destroying mills, which took a year to rebuild and left a district unable to grind grain. It meant cutting down vines and orchards, which took a decade. It meant seizing the harvest, and doing so at exactly the moment in the agricultural year when its loss was most catastrophic. The peasants of a contested region could lose everything they had, twice in 5 years, because two men they had never met could not resolve a question about a boundary stone. And here we should be careful not to be too comfortable about the moral position, because the knights involved would have found the criticism confusing rather than shameful. Those villagers were not innocent bystanders in their reckoning. They were the enemy's resources. Reducing them was the method by which pressure was applied to a man behind stone walls who could not otherwise be reached. It was, in its own terms, rational. It was simply rational in a way that produced catastrophic outcomes for everyone outside the argument. And there is one further effect of the feud culture worth noting, because it connects directly to everything else we have discussed tonight. Feuds gave knights a story to be inside. A man engaged in a long-inherited quarrel was not merely a landowner having an administrative dispute. He was a protagonist. He had an enemy, which is the most valuable thing a narrative can provide. He had wrongs to avenge, ancestors to honour, and a role that had been written for him before his birth. Every raid was a chapter. Every setback was a reason to continue. For men raised on romances about heroes with named adversaries and destinies to fulfill, this was not a burden. For a certain kind of knight, it was the most meaningful thing in his life. Which is a rather bleak observation. The feud was destructive, expensive, frequently pointless, and occasionally fatal to everyone involved. It was also, for many of the men caught up in it, the thing that made their existence feel like it mattered. And that appetite, the hunger to be inside a story rather than merely alive, was not something the feud created. It came from somewhere else entirely. It came from the halls, and the fires, and the long winter evenings when poets and singers stood before the assembled household and described a world where brave men did impossible things and were remembered forever. Because a great many knights had grown up on those stories, and some of them, as we are about to see, had never entirely worked out that they were fiction. Medieval Europe loved stories about knights. That is worth stating plainly, because we sometimes imagine that the romance of chivalry was invented afterwards by Victorian illustrators and painters of men in improbably clean armour. It was not. The medieval nobility produced an enormous body of heroic literature about themselves, consumed it constantly, and took it far more seriously than was healthy for anybody. Noble halls were full of it. Poems, songs, romances, and long-verse narratives were performed by professionals who travelled between courts and were paid well for it. A great household might hear the same beloved tales dozens of times across a lifetime, in the way that families return to the same films. Children grew up inside these stories the way children today grow up inside whatever their culture repeats. The most famous were the Arthurian romances, which spread across Europe from the 12th century onwards with a speed that suggests they were meeting a real demand. Knights of the Round Table. Quests undertaken for their own sake, ladies whose favour justified extraordinary effort, villains who were villains, obligingly, without complicating circumstances. Honour tested and vindicated. Fame achieved through courage and virtue, and then lasting forever. They were superb entertainment. They still are, which is why we have never stopped retelling them. The difficulty was that a certain number of listeners began treating them as career guidance. Now we should be precise here, because it is easy to condescend. Medieval noblemen were not simpletons who believed dragons were a genuine regional hazard. They understood perfectly well the difference between a poem and a chronicle. The distinction we are describing is subtler and much more familiar than we like to admit. Most people today can watch a film about a spy or a soldier or a boxer without attempting to imitate it. But the stories a culture tells still shape what its members find admirable, what shape they think a good life has, and which moments they think are worth risking something for. That influence works quietly, and it does not require anyone to believe the story literally. Medieval knights were subject to exactly that influence, with two aggravating factors. First, their stories were specifically about people in their own position, doing the things they were actually trained to do. And second, they had the equipment, the freedom, and the social encouragement to act on them. So they did. Across Europe, noblemen adopted the vocabulary and the customs of the romances with striking literalness. They dedicated victories to particular ladies. They wore tokens, sleeves, and colours in the lists. They adopted mottos and personal devices drawn from literature. They named their sons after fictional heroes, and by the 13th century a distinct fashion for Arthurian names appears in the records. Which means that somewhere in England or France there were grown men called Tristan and Gawain, going about ordinary business and presumably being teased about it. They went further. Great lords held what were called round tables, elaborate festivals combining feasting, jousting and role-play in which participants took the names of Arthur's knights for the duration. Edward III of England founded an entire order of chivalry with a deliberately Arthurian flavour, and other monarchs across Europe founded their own in competition, because prestige, as always, was a market. Sometimes this was harmless. Frequently it was expensive. Occasionally it was extremely embarrassing. And sometimes it killed people. The clearest examples come from the later Middle Ages, oddly enough, rather than the earlier period. This is one of history's better ironies. The high point of theatrical chivalric behaviour arrived when the military usefulness of knights was already in visible decline. As reality drifted further from the ideal, the performance of the ideal grew more elaborate, which is a pattern that recurs in institutions generally. Knights undertook formal quests specifically to demonstrate courage. Some swore public vows of considerable strangeness. Men bound themselves to wear a piece of armour continuously, or a chain, or a covering over one eye, until they had performed a particular feat of arms. Others swore to travel to a named place and hold a passage of arms there against all comers for a set number of days, which is genuinely a plot device from the romances being executed at expense in the real world. A few placed themselves in deliberate and unnecessary danger, not out of confusion, but out of calculation, because they had worked out that reputation could be manufactured by spectacle. To us this can look absurd. From inside the culture it followed perfectly. The heroes in the stories received undying admiration. The knights wanted undying admiration. The stories described the method. So the method was applied. Become the story. The trouble, as a great many of them discovered, was that real life was missing most of the conveniences that made the romances work. Dragons did not appear, which removed the single most convenient source of unambiguous glory. Wise enchanters were unavailable for consultation. Prophecies, where they could be obtained, proved unreliable. Ladies in distress were rarely encountered at the required intervals, and the ones who existed usually had families, lawyers of a sort, and opinions. Above all, enemies stubbornly refused to behave like supporting characters. They did not stand still while a hero delivered a challenge. They shot from a distance, they dug ditches, they chose ground carefully and waited. They declined battle when battle did not suit them, which the romances never mention, and which was in fact the single most common feature of medieval warfare. And real campaigning bore almost no resemblance to poetry. It was mud and dysentery and weeks of moving supplies and horses going lame and rain and boredom punctuated by very short periods of terror. It smelled. Men spent far more of their military careers hungry and uncomfortable than they ever spent being heroic. Yet the fantasy held, and here is why. Because a story does not need to be accurate to be useful. It needs only to make a difficult life feel significant. And that is what the romances did. They took a violent, uncertain, frequently squalid existence and offered a frame in which it meant something. A man who saw himself as merely a landowner with obligations and a dangerous job had very little to sustain him through a wet February siege. A man who saw himself as a protagonist had a great deal. So many knights carried that frame with them everywhere. Every tournament became a test of worth rather than a sporting event. Every feud became a quest with a moral shape. Every battle became an opportunity for the kind of moment that outlives the man who has it. And when a substantial number of people simultaneously believe they are the heroes of a grand narrative, something predictable follows. They begin accepting risks that anyone outside the story would sensibly decline. This is the point at which we should introduce some individuals, because the culture we have been describing produced actual people, and a few of them managed to stand out even among their peers. That is not a simple achievement when your entire profession already involves riding at strangers with a lance. Consider Sir John Hawkwood, an English knight of the 14th century whose career would have baffled the authors of the romances entirely. Hawkwood was not a great lord. He came from modest gentry origins in Essex, learned his trade in the French wars, and when peace interrupted his prospects, he did what a growing number of experienced soldiers were doing. He went to Italy and sold himself. For the next 30 years he commanded mercenary companies across the Italian peninsula, fighting for Pisa, for Milan, for the Pope, and eventually and most durably for Florence. He changed employers when the terms improved. He extracted payments from cities in exchange for not attacking them, which was a recognised business model at the time and considerably more profitable than fighting. He accumulated wealth, land, an Italian wife from a ducal family, and a level of professional respect that no English mercenary had any right to expect. To the traditional nobility, loyalty was sacred and permanent. To Hawkwood, loyalty was a contract with a term and a price, and he was punctilious about honouring it precisely as long as it ran, and Florence, when he died, gave him a state funeral and eventually commemorated him with an enormous painted monument inside their cathedral, where it remains. A commercial republic honouring a foreign professional soldier in a sacred space is not a scene the romances had prepared anyone for. Hawkwood matters not because he was villainous. By the standards of his profession he was relatively restrained. He matters because he represents the direction things were actually moving. The age of the heroic amateur was quietly giving way to the age of the paid professional, and men like him were the proof. Not every example is so straightforward. Some are considerably darker. Gilles de Rais of Brittany began his career in a manner that any romance would have approved of. He was enormously wealthy, well-connected, and a genuinely capable soldier who fought alongside Joan of Arc during the campaigns that turned the 100 Years' War, and was made Marshal of France while still a young man. By any external measure, he had achieved the thing the entire culture said men should want, and then his life disintegrated in ways that are frankly not suitable for a knight intended to help anyone sleep. He spent his enormous fortune with reckless abandon, including on theatrical productions of staggering expense. His family sought legal restrictions on his spending. He pursued increasingly desperate schemes to recover his wealth, and he was eventually tried and executed for crimes so appalling that they horrified a 15th century which was not easily horrified. We will leave the details entirely alone. But he belongs in this story for one reason. everything the culture rewarded: wealth, martial success, prestige, proximity to greatness. He possessed in abundance, and none of it functioned as any kind of restraint. Which raises a question worth carrying into what follows. If the chivalric system produced men like Hawkwood at one end and G. de Rais at the other, what exactly was it producing? And did anyone at the time notice the problem? They did, rather more than we usually assume. Contrary to a very persistent modern assumption, people in the Middle Ages were not blind to the recklessness of their own warrior class. They noticed, they complained, and in some cases they wrote about it with a weariness that comes through the centuries perfectly intact. This is worth emphasizing, because we have a habit of imagining previous eras as uniformly credulous, as though nobody before roughly 1750 had ever raised an eyebrow at anything. The medieval record does not support that at all. Chroniclers criticised arrogant nobles constantly. They mocked foolish decisions, often by name. They recorded with evident satisfaction the moments when a boastful lord came to grief in a manner he had been specifically warned about. Clergy denounced the whole business at length, sometimes with genuine anger. Preachers described the knightly class as men who had confused pride with virtue and slaughter with service. Moralists produced treatises listing exactly what was wrong with contemporary chivalry, which tells us both that they thought it was fixable and that it needed fixing. Even the chivalric literature itself, the very material we have been blaming for the whole problem, contained its own critique. The later Arthurian cycles are not triumphant. They are elegies. The Round Table collapses, and it collapses from within, destroyed by the private loyalties, personal quarrels, and inflexible honour of the very men who embodied its ideals. Lancelot's virtues destroy the kingdom. Gawain's insistence on vengeance for his brothers dooms everyone. Medieval audiences heard that and understood it. The stories were telling them that honour taken far enough would eat everything. They enjoyed the stories enormously and continued behaving exactly as before, which is perhaps the most human detail in the entire subject. There were even practical voices. Military writers of the later Middle Ages produced advice that reads as remarkably sensible. Choose your ground. Do not fight when you can wait. Do not charge cavalry into prepared positions. Keep your men fed and your horses rested. Scout properly. These men were not writing in a vacuum. They were writing because they had watched competent armies destroyed by commanders who preferred glory to arithmetic, and they were trying to prevent it happening again. Their advice was read, admired, copied into fine manuscripts, and ignored at exactly the moments it mattered most. Because here is the difficulty. Understanding a problem intellectually and being able to act on that understanding in front of your peers are entirely separate capacities. A knight might agree, sitting in a hall in January, that reckless charges were foolish. In August, on a field, with 300 men watching, and a rival already moving forward, that January conclusion was of no practical use whatsoever. The chroniclers had identified something real. Courage and recklessness are not the same thing. But drawing that distinction becomes almost impossible in a culture where the reward for both is identical right up until the outcome is known. And that brings us to the moment when the argument stopped being philosophical, because reality was preparing a lesson that would not be ignored, and it arrived in the form of a weapon operated by men the knightly class had spent 3 centuries not bothering to think about. For generations, the heavy cavalry charge had been the decisive instrument of European warfare. Not invincible, and any honest reading of the sources shows knights being defeated repeatedly by infantry, terrain, and their own indiscipline throughout the period. But it had a genuine claim to being the most powerful single tactical tool available, and the men who delivered it occupied the top of society partly because of it. If you had asked a knight in the year 1300 who would control the future of warfare, his answer would almost certainly have been people exactly like himself. There was no reason for him to think otherwise. Everything he could see confirmed it. The warnings began arriving early in the 14th century, and from unexpected directions. At Courtrai in 1302, a Flemish militia of townsmen and craftsmen, standing in a strong position behind streams and ditches, destroyed a French army of knights. The victors collected hundreds of golden spurs from the dead and hung them in a church. Townsmen, weavers and butchers, in the French account of it, which was written by men who found the whole thing not merely a defeat, but an offence against the natural order. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish infantry in tight formation broke an English army that substantially outnumbered them. And then came the English longbow, deployed by commanders who had learned something important during their wars in Wales and Scotland. At Crecy in 1346, at Poitiers 10 years later, and most famously at Agincourt in 1415, French armies of formidable quality attacked English positions defended by archers and were destroyed. Not narrowly, comprehensively, and with casualty ratios that are genuinely difficult to believe. And the crucial detail, the one that makes these battles so revealing for our purposes tonight, is that the French made essentially the same mistake 3 times across 70 years. They knew. That is the extraordinary part. After Crecy, French commanders understood the problem. There were experienced men in the French army at Agincourt who had thought carefully about how to fight the English. And there was a plan. It was not a bad plan. It fell apart because of everything we have spent this evening describing. The French nobility at Agincourt were not short of courage or equipment. They were short of the ability to not go forward. The great lords competed for position in the front line, because being in the front line was where reputation was made, and this crowded the formation into a mass that could not manoeuvre. Men who had been assigned to the flanking cavalry drifted toward the centre for the same reason. Advice to wait, to let the English starve or move, was available and was overruled, partly because waiting resembled hesitation and hesitation resembled fear. So they advanced across a ploughed field, recently rained on in heavy armour, into a narrowing funnel between 2 woods, toward men who had spent the previous night driving sharpened stakes into the ground. The result was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a crush. Men fell and could not rise. Men behind pressed forward and fell on top of them. A significant proportion of the French dead were not killed by English weapons at all, and they went forward because retreat was shameful, hesitation was shameful, and waiting was uncomfortably adjacent to hesitation. The fact that several thousand archers were waiting on the other side somehow failed to alter the calculation. We should be careful not to be smug about this. Individual acts of bravery at these battles were genuinely astonishing, and the chroniclers, including English ones, record them with real respect. Men fought on after losing horses, after being wounded, after being surrounded. Some refused offered chances to withdraw because they judged their reputation required them to stay, and they were not wrong about how it would have been reported. From a modern perspective, this looks irrational. From inside their world, reputation frequently outlived the body, and a great many of them cared deeply about what would be said in halls they would never enter again. But the deeper failure was structural, and it involves something we touched on right at the beginning of tonight. Every generation remembered the rare men who had charged against the odds and won. Nobody kept a running total of the far larger number who had attempted the same thing and were immediately introduced to reality. That is a form of statistical blindness, and it is not a medieval affliction. It is a human one. We remember the founder who dropped out and succeeded. We do not have a list of the thousands who dropped out and did not. Medieval knights had exactly the same problem, with the added difficulty that their sampling error was delivered to them as poetry by professionals. A young man might hear 10 stories of glorious last stands. He would never hear a detailed accounting of the hundreds of men who had tried something similar and simply died in a field, unrecorded, because there was nothing interesting to say about it. History remembers legends. It has never been enthusiastic about remembering the base rate, and the changes did not stop with archers. Infantry became steadily more important. Swiss pikemen demonstrated that disciplined formations could not merely resist cavalry, but destroy it. Kings began building larger standing forces that depended less on the personal enthusiasm of individual nobles and more on organisation, pay, drill and supply. which was, from a knight's perspective, an insult of a particularly refined kind. Because logistics has never been glamorous. Nobody composes epic verse about the arrival of the supply wagons on schedule, and yet the wagons decided more campaigns than any charge ever did. Then came gunpowder. The earliest firearms were dreadful. They were slow, inaccurate, unreliable in rain, and posed a meaningful risk to the person holding them. Many knights regarded them with open contempt, and there is a certain amount of sympathy owed here. Imagine devoting your entire life from the age of 7 to horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the mastery of a genuinely difficult craft, and then discovering that a farmer given 3 weeks of instruction and a metal tube could end your career from a distance without ever learning your name. It felt unfair, because it was unfair. It was also permanent. Cannon brought down walls that had stood for 200 years. Firearms progressively reduced the value of increasingly expensive armour, and the armourers responded by making it thicker and heavier and more expensive until the whole equation collapsed under its own cost. The battlefield had begun rewarding coordination over individual brilliance and mathematics over romance. Some knights adapted, many became cavalry officers in the new professional armies, and the aristocracy retained its military role for centuries in a different form. Others never adapted at all, and continued pursuing personal glory and dramatic gestures on battlefields that had entirely stopped rewarding them. By the 16th century, the age of the knight as a decisive military force was ending. Which leaves us with the question we have been circling all night. Were these men actually insane? Or were they something rather more uncomfortable than that? So, after everything we have wandered through tonight, we arrive at the question the whole journey was built around. Were medieval knights insane? And the honest answer is both simpler and more troubling than we might like. No, most of them were not. They were not wandering the corridors of castles conversing with invisible dragons, or challenging their own furniture to single combat, or suffering from any condition a physician would recognise. For the overwhelming majority, they were intelligent, capable, competent men behaving exactly as the world around them had taught them to behave, and receiving, for the most part, exactly the responses that world had promised. The madness, if we insist on the word, was not located in the individual, it was distributed across the system. Imagine growing up in a world where your entire worth depends on being seen as brave, where your reputation determines whether your family prospers or declines, where the stories you are raised on celebrate men who take extraordinary risks and never mention the ones who did not survive them, where your religion at certain points tells you that fighting can save your soul, where honour matters more than comfort, more than money, and sometimes more than survival, where backing down is not a private embarrassment but a public and permanent loss, and where glory offers the only form of immortality anyone has ever credibly promised you. Under those conditions, almost every decision we have examined tonight stops looking irrational and starts looking predictable, not sensible. That word is doing important work and I want to keep it separate. Understandable and sensible are not the same thing. The knight who charged a larger army was not mad. He was following with real fidelity a set of values that had been reinforced in him from the age of 7 by everyone he respected. The nobleman who spent 30 years pursuing a feud was not deranged. He was protecting the reputation on which his family's entire position rested, in a world where no court could reliably protect it for him. The crusader walking 2,000 miles was not simply chasing adventure. He believed, in a way that is genuinely difficult for us to reconstruct, that he was participating in something eternal. Each of them was behaving rationally inside a frame. The frame was the problem, and this is where the subject stops being a comfortable historical curiosity and becomes something with rather sharper edges. Because what appears insane from one century very frequently appears perfectly logical from another. Every society generates its own version of common sense, and the defining feature of common sense is that the people living inside it cannot see it. It does not feel like a set of assumptions. It feels like reality. The Romans believed that civilization depended on the permanent conquest of neighbours, and considered this so obvious that it barely required defending. The Vikings believed that a reputation which outlived you was worth almost any risk. The knights believed honour was worth almost any sacrifice. None of these people were stupid. All of them were operating inside a frame they had not chosen and could not see the edges of. And we are doing the same thing, right now, tonight. There are things we believe, collectively and without much examination. That will look extraordinary to whoever is listening to stories about us in 800 years. We do not know which things they are. That is rather the point. If we could identify them, they would not be assumptions. They would be opinions. The medieval knight was not a different species of human. He was a person shaped by his circumstances, exactly as we are shaped by ours. And the difference is not intelligence or wisdom or moral seriousness. The difference is that we can see his frame from the outside, and he could not, and nobody can see their own. Yet there is another reason these men continue to hold our attention, centuries after the last of them put down the lance, and it is worth ending on. For all their contradictions, all their expensive foolishness, all their catastrophic misjudgments, they possessed qualities that remain genuinely admirable. Courage, of a kind most of us will never be asked to demonstrate. Endurance, in conditions we would find intolerable. Loyalty, sometimes maintained at ruinous cost to themselves. Discipline, in the sense of decades spent mastering a difficult craft. A willingness to be judged publicly on their performance, which is not nothing. And an insistence, however imperfectly practiced, that there were things a man ought not to do even when he could. Because chivalry did produce restraint as well as excess. It was real. The obligation to protect the defenceless was frequently ignored, but it was frequently honoured too, and a society which at least articulates such a duty is doing something a society which does not articulate it is failing to do. The knight who spared a beaten opponent, who kept his word to an enemy, who paid a ransom he could have refused, who defended a household that could not defend itself, existed in large numbers. He simply made less interesting reading than his opposite. The problem was never that these were bad virtues. The problem is that virtues do not have natural limits, and almost every one of them becomes dangerous when pushed far enough. Courage taken to its extreme becomes recklessness. Confidence becomes arrogance. Loyalty becomes blind attachment to people who do not deserve it. Discipline becomes rigidity. Honour, which began as a way of being trustworthy, became an obsession that consumed lands, families, and lifetimes. And there is no obvious point on that scale where a bell rings and tells you that you have gone too far. That is precisely what makes the whole thing so difficult. The knight riding forward at Agincourt did not experience himself as reckless. He experienced himself as brave. From the inside, those two things feel identical, and the difference is only ever revealed afterwards, by the outcome, which is not available at the time you have to decide. So the story of the medieval knight is, in the end, not really a story about armour. It is a story about what happens when a society decides which qualities it will reward, and then discovers that people will pursue those rewards past every reasonable stopping point. It is a story about incentives, and how invisible they are to the people living inside them. It is a story about the enormous power of the tales we tell our children about what a good life looks like, and it is a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary error, frequently in the same act, occasionally in the same moment, and that separating the two is often only possible from a very great distance. Perhaps that is why they still hold us. Not because they were perfect heroes. They were not, and the more closely you look at the records, the less perfect they become. But because they were so thoroughly, recognisably human. Ambitious, frightened, vain, brave, loyal, competitive, desperate to be thought well of by people whose opinion should not have mattered nearly as much as it did. Just human beings, in 60 pounds of steel, making irreversible decisions at a full gallop, which history demonstrated, repeatedly and expensively, is not the ideal environment for careful reflection. And on that reassuring note, our long journey through the strange and wonderfully chaotic world of medieval knighthood comes to an end. The tournaments are over. The fields where those charges happened are quiet now, mostly farmland, mostly unmarked, grazed by cattle who have no opinion on any of it. The castles that men locked themselves inside are ruins with visitor centres and gift shops. The songs those men risked everything to be included in are studied by a small number of specialists and read by almost nobody else, which is the fate of nearly all fame and a fact none of them would have found bearable. And yet here we are, 800 years later, still talking about them in the dark, which is, in a way, the thing they wanted. Not quite in the form they imagined. But they are remembered, and by strangers in a language most of them never spoke, in a world they could not have described. If that is what they were chasing, then a handful of them got it after all. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey and would like more of them, you are very welcome to leave a like and to subscribe if you have not already, so these long, slow stories find their way back to you on the next quiet evening. And do leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what hour it had reached where you are. I always read them, and there is something quietly lovely about seeing how far these old stories travel. If there is a corner of history you would like to wander through next, tell me. The list of things worth exploring is considerably longer than the number of nights available, and I am always glad of a suggestion. For now, though, there is nothing further required of you. No horse to prepare, no armour to check, no rival across the valley composing an insult you will be obliged to answer. Rest well, sleep deeply, and unlike a medieval knight, you almost certainly will not need to wake up tomorrow and defend your honour before breakfast. Good night, peace.